Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight you are stepping into a world of candlelight and quietude. You are moving backward through time, past the electric hum of modern life, past the constant chatter of our contemporary world, and into the stillness of late 18th century Virginia. The year is somewhere between 1775 and 1799. The house is Mount Vernon, and you are about to experience what very few people have ever truly witnessed. The private, unguarded moments of a man who would shape a nation, when almost everyone else has gone to sleep. This is not a story about battles or bold proclamations. This is not about the drama of war rooms or the weight of political decision-making, though all of those things existed in George Washington's life. Instead, tonight we are going to move slowly, carefully through the hours that belonged only to him. We are going to explore the simple human rituals that filled his midnight hours, the thoughts that might have crossed his mind as he prepared for sleep, the environment that surrounded him in those quiet, private moments when the mask of leadership could finally rest. What did he read before bed? How did he manage pain and worry when no one was watching? What sounds filled his bedroom? What did sleep itself mean to a man who carried the weight of a nascent nation on his shoulders? These are the questions that will guide us through the darkness tonight. Gentle engagement before we venture deeper into this story. I want to say something to you directly. If you're here because you enjoy calm, detailed historical narratives, because you find comfort in the slow unfolding of human stories from centuries past, I would be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. Not because I'm asking for metrics or engagement, but because if you stay with me through these long nights of history, you might want more of them. There's something about moving through time slowly, deliberately, that changes how we understand the past. It makes it less like something that happened to other people and more like something that could have happened to us. The algorithm of modern life doesn't typically reward this kind of storytelling. It wants you to move quickly from one piece of information to the next. But you're here, and that tells me you want something different tonight. You want to linger, you want to settle in, and I'm grateful for that. So if you find yourself returning to this story on other nights, if you find the rhythm of it soothing, please do subscribe. And now let us move together into Mount Vernon, into the evening hours, and into the private world of George Washington. Dusk arrives at Mount Vernon, the day is ending. It has been a day like so many others in the life of George Washington, though the particular struggles and concerns have shifted depending on what year we are imagining. But let's say it's a day in the 1790s after the war, after he has already served as the nation's first president for several years. He has recently retired from that office, returned to his beloved Mount Vernon, and is attempting to reclaim some semblance of a private life. This, as you might imagine, is not entirely possible. Correspondence never ceases. Visitors arrive regularly. The business of the plantation continues. The management of slaves continues, a moral weight that sits heavy on our story and cannot be ignored or softened, but still he tries. The sun is beginning its descent over the Potomac River, which borders his property to the east. The river is wide here, nearly 2 miles at its widest point, and the light that reflects off its surface in the late afternoon has a particular quality to it. It is golden, yes, but it is also soft, muted, as though the water itself is absorbing some of the harshness of daylight and returning something gentler to the world. If you were standing on the lawn of Mount Vernon at this hour, the brick mansion rising behind you, you would notice how the light seems to pool in the low places and slide across the higher surfaces. The red brick of the main house would glow warm, almost amber. The windows would become mirrors, reflecting the sky more than revealing the interior. The evening air begins to change in character. The heat of the day, which in summer can be quite intense in Virginia, begins to release its hold on the land. There is a movement of air that is not quite a breeze, but is noticeably cooler than what came before it. It carries with it the smell of the river, that particular green smell of water moving slowly past trees and banks, and it also carries the smell of the gardens, the kitchens, the stables, the 1,000 small working places that make up a plantation of this size. These are not necessarily pleasant smells, and historians of the period are often careful not to sanitize what life actually smelled like. There would be the smell of manure, of smoke from the kitchens, of sweat and labor, and the hard work of keeping such an estate functioning. But there would also be the smell of earth, of growing things, of the forest that still surrounds much of the property. George Washington himself, during these late afternoon hours, would be concluding whatever business had occupied his day. If he had been out riding, which he often did, he would be returning to the house. The riding itself was not simply for pleasure, though he did enjoy it. It was a necessity of plantation management. He would ride out to inspect different parts of his lands, to observe the work being done, to speak with overseers and workers, to understand the condition of his crops and animals and the various projects that were always underway. The riding was also perhaps a form of solitude. Out on horseback, moving through his own land, he could think. The rhythm of the horse's movement, the familiar landscape passing around him, these things would occupy the conscious mind while a deeper part of him processed concerns and decisions. When he returned, he would leave his horse with the stablemen. They would care for the animal, brushing it down, watering it, ensuring its comfort. This too was part of the rhythm of the day. The animals had to be tended. And Washington, by all accounts, took reasonable care of his animals, though he also lived in an era when such care was quite different from what we would consider acceptable today. The stables at Mount Vernon were substantial structures, and the horses that lived there were important investments and tools of his daily life. To step into the stables in the late afternoon would be to enter a place of warmth and activity. The smell would be immediate and powerful. Hay, manure, leather, sweat, the particular smell of many animals in close quarters. The sounds would be equally present, the shifting of animals in their stalls, the clank of metal tack being moved and cleaned, the voices of the people who worked there. But Washington would not linger long in the stables. His day's work was concluding, and the business of preparing for evening was beginning elsewhere in the mansion. Inside Mount Vernon, the household would be shifting into its evening rhythms. The kitchens would be actively preparing the evening meal. Candles would be lit in various rooms. Oil lamps would be prepared. The work of maintaining the house in candlelight required preparation. These light sources were not instantaneous. They had to be lit, tended, monitored. A single candle in a bedroom provided surprisingly little light, and someone reading or writing would need several candles clustered nearby. This meant that the distribution of light sources throughout the house required planning and resources. Candles were made from tallow, which had a particular smell, smoky and somewhat acrid, or from whale oil, which burned cleaner and brighter but was more expensive. The wealthier the household, the more likely it was to have whale oil candles in the main living areas and tallow candles in the service areas and bedrooms. Mount Vernon, Washington's home, was a substantial house, though not as enormous as it sometimes appears in modern depictions. The main house, the brick building that visitors typically imagine when they think of Mount Vernon, was constructed over many years. Washington inherited a much smaller house from his half-brother Lawrence and then spent decades expanding and improving it. By the 1790s, it had taken on much of the character it would maintain. The main entrance faced east toward the river. Behind the house, the land sloped upward slightly. To the north and south were various outbuildings, dependencies as they were called, which housed the kitchens, the servant quarters, the storage areas, and the various workshops necessary for self-sufficient plantation life. The bedroom that Washington used for sleeping, where we are eventually heading in this narrative, was located on the second floor of the main house. It was not the largest or most elaborate room in the mansion. That honor would belong to the dining room or perhaps the parlor. The bedroom was a more private space, and Washington seemed to prefer it that way. The walls would have been painted, likely in a muted color, perhaps a pale gray or cream. The ceiling would have been plaster. Windows would have looked out over the grounds. On cool evenings, these windows might be open to allow air to circulate. On warm evenings, they might be closed to keep insects out. Those screens, as we know them, did not exist. Instead, people relied on smoke from candles and fires to deter insects, or simply accepted their presence as part of the environment. As evening settles fully over Mount Vernon, the quality of light changes dramatically. The sun, which has been sinking for the past hour, now dips below the horizon. For a brief period, the sky holds a strange color, neither day nor night. This is the time that painters call the golden hour, though by its end it becomes more purple and blue. The light at this time comes from the sky rather than from the sun, and it has a quality of softness and melancholy. If you were standing on the lawn of Mount Vernon at this moment, you would see the river becoming darker, less reflective. The trees around the property would become silhouettes, and the windows of the house would begin to glow with the warm light of candles and lamps lit inside. The transition from daylight to darkness is not instantaneous in the way that we, living with electric light, might assume. The change takes time, nearly an hour, and during this time the world exists in a kind of twilight. For someone who has lived his entire life without electric light as Washington had, this transition would be as natural as breathing. But it would also be a significant moment in the day. As the light fades, the world outside becomes less accessible. You can no longer easily read a letter held close to a window. You can no longer clearly see across a room without a candle. The fading of daylight marked a genuine shift in human activity. Work that required good light would be concluded. Activities that could be done by candlelight would continue. Sleep would become a reasonable prospect. And as this transition from day to night settles over Mount Vernon, George Washington would be preparing to move through the evening toward the rituals and routines that would eventually lead to sleep. He would be thinking about this or not thinking about it, depending on the nature of his mind that evening. He might be tired, he might be restless. He might be preoccupied with concerns about the nation, about his plantation, about his health, which was never particularly robust. Or he might be simply moving through the hours as people do, one moment following another, the day ending as all days do. The evening meal and social rituals. The evening meal at Mount Vernon would typically be served between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or perhaps a bit later depending on the season and the specific day. By modern standards, this would seem quite early for dinner, but dining times have changed considerably over the centuries. In the 18th century, and particularly in America, dinner was the main meal of the day and was eaten in the afternoon. A lighter meal called supper might be eaten later in the evening. For someone of Washington's status and habits, the evening meal would be a structured affair, though not necessarily an elaborate one on every occasion. The dining room at Mount Vernon is one of the most impressive spaces in the house. It is large, well-proportioned, with a ceiling that rises to a considerable height. The walls are painted in a warm color, and the windows are tall and allow good light during the day. When we imagine Washington dining here in the evening, we are imagining it lit by candlelight. The candles would be arranged in candelabra, perhaps on the sideboard, perhaps on the table itself. The light would flicker slightly with any movement of air, creating a gentle, moving illumination. Shadows would shift across the walls and the faces of those gathered around the table, who would be dining with Washington on a typical evening. This varied considerably depending on the season and the circumstances. Mount Vernon was a well-known house, and Washington received visitors regularly. When important guests were staying, the evening meal would be a more formal affair, with multiple courses, specific protocols about who sat where, careful attention to the rituals of dining. But on quieter evenings, when he was alone or with only family or close associates, the meal might be simpler. His wife, Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, had married him after her first husband's death, and she would often be at table with him. Various family members might be present. If grandchildren were staying at Mount Vernon, they might be at the meal, though children of the era often had different meal arrangements and schedules than adults. The food itself would have been prepared in the separate kitchen building, which stood some distance from the main house. The kitchen would have been a hot, smoky place, lit by the fire necessary for cooking. The food would have been prepared by enslaved workers, and the labor of that kitchen was constant and difficult. Food would have been carried from the kitchen to the main house, which meant it would be somewhat cooled by the time it reached the table, unless it was kept near a fire or in a special warming chamber. The journey from kitchen to dining room was a significant one, a testament to the separation of the working parts of the plantation from the living quarters of the family, what would have been served. Mount Vernon had access to substantial resources, and Washington was able to eat well, though he was not particularly known for excessive consumption or elaborate meals. The Virginia plantation economy provided beef, pork, chicken, and other meats. The gardens at Mount Vernon were extensive, and Washington took considerable interest in them, so vegetables would have been available in season. Grains, bread, some dairy products, preserved fruits and vegetables, fish from the river, all of these would have been part of the diet. A typical meal might have included roasted meat, vegetables, bread, sauce or gravy, cheese, perhaps fruit or preserved fruit, and certainly drink. Wine was often present at the table, and Washington drank moderately, though he also drank beer and cider, beverages that were safer than water in an era before modern sanitation. The rhythm of the meal itself would have been different from modern dining. Meals of the period were often lengthy affairs. There was no television or other distraction, and the meal itself was a social event. Conversation would have been important. If there were guests of note, the conversation might turn to politics, to current events, to intellectual topics. Washington was not known as a particularly brilliant conversationalist, but he was well informed and thoughtful. He was also careful in conversation, aware that his words carried weight and that he was often in positions where what he said would be noted and reported. There was a certain formality to his manner, even in relatively private settings, that kept him somewhat removed from unbridled social exchange. The specific content of conversations at Mount Vernon's dining table during Washington's retirement years might have touched on many topics. The new nation was still finding its footing. Political divisions, which would eventually harden into the party system we know today, were already emerging. The question of slavery, which Washington personally struggled with in ways that remain historically debated, was present in the background of 18th century thought. Current agricultural practices, the management of the plantation, improvements and experiments in farming, these would have been topics of interest to Washington, who took considerable pride in his agricultural work. The news from the wider world brought by visitors and letters would have been discussed. The health and circumstances of family members would have been of interest. But alongside these substantial topics, there would also have been the small talk and lighter conversation that characterizes any meal. Comments about the weather, observations about guests, amusement at the antics of children, gentle humor, the social lubricants that allow people to spend time together. The evening meal was not a source of tension in Washington's life generally. It was a structured, expected part of the day. It provided nourishment. It provided social connection. It marked a boundary between the work of the day and the evening hours that followed. As the meal concluded, there would be a shift in the gathering. Depending on the formality and the people present, there might be a separation between men and women, a custom that was practiced in some circles at the time, though not universally and not rigidly. The men might withdraw to smoke or drink, while the women moved to a separate parlor. Or everyone might remain in the dining room for a while longer, transitioning to lighter refreshments, perhaps tea or coffee, which were becoming more common in American households of this era, though still considered somewhat luxurious. If Washington had had a particularly demanding day, if he was tired or if his health was troubling him, he might have retired to his chamber earlier in the evening. But typically he would have spent some hours in the parlor or other common rooms, engaging in the social life of the household. This might have included reading if books or newspapers were available. It might have included conversation. It might have included quiet work such as writing letters or reviewing accounts. Mount Vernon was a working plantation, and even in the evening there was business to attend to. The household itself, the servants and enslaved people who made Mount Vernon function, would have been carrying out their own evening routines. The kitchen fires would be banked but not fully extinguished. Water would be heated for washing. Chambers would be prepared. Candles would be distributed to those who needed them for their final tasks of the day. The children of enslaved people who lived at Mount Vernon would be settling into their own sleeping arrangements, often in quarters that were quite different from the main house and considerably less comfortable. As the evening progresses, the light becomes entirely dependent on artificial sources. The windows of Mount Vernon are now dark rectangles against the blackness of the night. The candles inside create islands of light in a sea of darkness. Outside, the night is profound. There are no streetlights, no distant lights from other houses, no electric glow on the horizon. The darkness is nearly complete, broken only by starlight and if the moon is visible by its pale illumination. Sounds become more prominent in darkness. The wind, which you might have noticed visually during the day, becomes something you hear. Small creatures that are active at night, insects and frogs and other animals, create a chorus of sound. The river, which is always present, seems to become more present at night, a constant sound of water moving. For someone like Washington, who had lived his entire life in a world lit primarily by fire and candlelight, the night was not a time of complete darkness, but neither was it the well-lit, daylight-like illumination that electric light now provides at any hour. The night had its own character, its own rhythm. and moving through it required adjustment, habit, and a different way of perceiving the world. The retirement, YEARS, and evening solitude. We should pause here and acknowledge something about the particular moment in Washington's life that we are exploring. He is, in this narrative, a man in his 60s, sometimes in his late 60s, which in the 18th century was a considerable age. He has already lived a full life. He has fought in wars, managed large enterprises, shaped a nation, held the highest office in a new country. He has done things that will be remembered. He has also endured hardship, known failure, struggled with doubt, and lived with the constant weight of responsibility. When Washington retired from the presidency in 1797, he was genuinely retiring. He was not leaving the public stage temporarily to return to it. He intended, as much as he could, to live privately at Mount Vernon. He was interested in agricultural experimentation, in the management of his estate, in the company of family and close friends. He was also, and this cannot be overstated, tired. The presidency had been exhausting. The responsibilities were enormous. The scrutiny was constant. The need to maintain a certain image, to make decisions that affected millions of people, to manage political factions and personal ambitions, all of this had worn on him. So when we imagine Washington in the evening hours of his retirement, we are imagining a man who has something he did not have for many years: the possibility of genuine rest, not the absence of concern, certainly not that. The nation would always be his concern. The estate would always require management, but the particular relentless pressure of the presidency was lifted. He could, theoretically, spend an evening without the weight of his office pressing against him at every moment. In the hours after dinner, after the social obligations of the evening meal had been completed, Washington would often withdraw to his study or chamber. This would be a small space, smaller than the grand rooms of the main house, but comfortable and familiar. The study would contain his desk, his books, his papers, his writing implements. This would be a place where he spent considerable time dealing with the correspondence that never ceased, reviewing accounts, reading, thinking through problems. The quality of the light in the study would be determined by the candles placed there. If Washington was reading or writing, he would need multiple candles placed close to his work. The light of candles is remarkably dim by modern standards. A single candle might produce light equivalent to what we would consider a very dim lamp. Multiple candles clustered around the area where work was being done could create a circle of reasonably good light, but outside that circle, the room would be quite dark. Your eyes would adjust to this, and people of the era were accustomed to reading and working by candlelight, but it was nonetheless a limited form of illumination. The correspondence that Washington dealt with in these evening hours was substantial. He was a man of letters in the literal sense. He wrote consistently, sometimes extensively, and he received much correspondence in return. Much of this was administrative, dealing with the affairs of the plantation, but some of it was personal. He wrote to family members, he wrote to friends, he wrote to people who sought his advice or his influence. These letters would have been written by hand in ink on paper. The act of writing itself was more laborious than it is today. Quills had to be sharpened. Ink had to be kept in the proper consistency. Paper was relatively expensive. The physical act of writing was slower, more deliberate. Some of Washington's letters from this period still exist, and they reveal a man who was attentive to detail, careful in his words, sometimes quite revealing about his inner states despite his general caution. He writes about his health, which was frequently troublesome. He writes about the weather, which affected agricultural work. He writes about family matters, though often with a certain restraint that was characteristic of the era. He writes about political developments, trying to maintain a position of dignified distance from the partisan conflicts that were emerging, though not always successfully. As the evening hours deepened, the household around Washington would be gradually quieting. The servants and enslaved people who maintained the household would be completing their final tasks. The kitchens would be secured for the night. The animals would be settled. The various fires that provided heat and light would be carefully tended, as leaving them unattended was a serious fire risk, particularly in a house made substantially of wood. The candles distributed throughout the house would be extinguished in the rooms that were no longer in use, as candles were a significant expense and waste was frowned upon. The sounds of the house would change. During the day, there is the constant hum of activity, of people working, moving, speaking, the sounds of a busy household. As evening settles and as the hours grow late, these sounds diminish. There is the creaking of wooden floors and stairs as people move about. There is the sound of wind outside, more noticeable in the silence. There is the occasional sound of animals, horses in the stables, dogs that might be loose or kennelled, other creatures that are active at night. For someone lying in bed, awake or attempting to sleep, these sounds would form the acoustic background of the night. Washington's own evening, as he moved towards sleep, would have involved various preparations. He would have completed his writing or reading. He would have changed his clothes, removing the formal or semi-formal wear that he had worn during the day and changing into sleeping clothes. The bedclothes themselves would be prepared, warmed perhaps by the use of a warming pan, a container filled with hot coals that was moved through the bed to take the chill off the sheets before sleeping. This was a service that would have been performed by servants, part of the ritualistic preparation for sleep. The specific concerns that occupied Washington's mind during these evening hours would have varied depending on the day and the season and the state of the world. Sometimes he would have been preoccupied with agricultural matters. Mount Vernon was a working plantation, and even in retirement, Washington took considerable interest in the practical matters of farming. Sometimes he would have been troubled by political developments, by news from the nation that he had helped create. Sometimes he would have been preoccupied with health matters, his own or those of people close to him. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours, he might have reflected on his life, his choices, the things he had done, the things he had left undone. There is a particular kind of solitude that comes in the evening, especially for someone living in a structured household where there are always other people present. That solitude is not about being alone necessarily. It is about being released from the performance of a public role. Washington, even in retirement, was always aware that he was George Washington, the founding president, the man of consequence. But in the evening, in his study preparing for sleep, the weight of that identity might have lifted slightly. He could be simply a man, aging reflective, dealing with the ordinary concerns of an aging body and mind. Health habits and the particulars of evening care. To understand Washington's evening and night routines, we must understand his health, because his health shaped his habits in significant ways. Washington was not a vigorous man. He was fit, certainly, and he was capable of substantial physical work, but he was also prone to various ailments, and he was aware of his body in ways that suggest he experienced ongoing physical discomfort. The ailments that troubled Washington throughout his life included dental problems, which were significant and which affected his appearance, his comfort, and his ability to eat. By the time of his retirement, Washington had lost many of his original teeth and wore dentures, which were made from a variety of materials including human teeth, animal teeth, and ivory. These dentures were uncomfortable, would have required careful maintenance, and would have been troublesome in various social situations. The pain associated with dental problems, which Washington experienced for decades, is something we should acknowledge as part of the background of his daily experience. Beyond dental problems, Washington experienced various chronic ailments that are difficult to diagnose with precision from a historical distance. He complained of fevers, of joint pain, of digestive troubles. He was aware of his temperament and his emotional state, and he seemed to struggle with what we might now call depression or melancholy. He was a man who was attentive to his body, reading medical literature, seeking advice from physicians, trying various treatments and remedies. In the 18th century, the understanding of disease and health was quite different from modern medicine. The theory of humors, the idea that health depended on a balance of four humors, blood, phlegm, choler, and melancholy, still held significant sway. Bleeding and purging were common treatments. Various herbal remedies were used. The use of opium and laudanum for pain relief was not uncommon, though their addictive properties were not fully understood. Alcohol, both as medicine and as comfort, was consumed regularly. As evening came and Washington prepared for sleep, he might have taken various preparations meant to promote rest or to address particular ailments. A warm drink, perhaps milk, or a weak alcoholic beverage might have been consumed. Various herbal preparations might have been taken. If his joints were paining him, which was increasingly the case as he aged, he might have applied salves or liniments that were meant to provide relief. These preparations were products of 18th century medicine and chemistry, some of which might have provided genuine relief, some of which might have been purely placebo, and some of which might have actually been harmful. The evening preparation for bed was not a quick affair. It involved various steps and rituals. The body had to be cleaned, or at least certain parts of it. In an era before hot running water, this would have involved using water that had been heated and carried to the bedroom. Washing might be accomplished using a basin and pitcher. Certain areas of the body, the face and hands certainly, would be washed before bed. A more complete washing of the whole body would have been less common in the evening, though it would have occurred periodically. The clothes would be removed and set aside for servants to manage. The sleeping clothes would be donned. For a man of Washington's era and status, this would typically be a nightshirt, which would be relatively simple, made of linen or cotton, covering the body and extending to somewhere around the knees. The nightshirt would be more comfortable than the structured clothing worn during the day, which included tight breeches, close-fitting jackets, and various layers. The simple, loose-fitting nightshirt would have been a relief to the body. The feet, which in the 18th century were often cold, might be wrapped or might be warmed by the use of warmed water for soaking. There might be various preparations applied to the feet, salves or liniments meant to address particular ailments or to promote comfort. The hair, which Washington would have worn relatively long, would be prepared for sleep. If he wore a nightcap, which was common for men of the era for various practical reasons, it would be donned. Now, as Washington settles into bed, we should pause and consider what that bed is actually like. The beds of the 18th century were quite different from modern beds. The bed frame would be substantial, made of wood, often carved or decorated in some way. The mattress would be filled with straw, or more likely for someone of Washington's means, with feathers or a combination of feathers and other materials. The mattress would rest on ropes or webbing strung across the bed frame. These ropes or webbing could be tightened when they became slack, which was a regular occurrence, and this tightening was often referred to as making the bed, a name that has persisted into modern times, though the mechanism has changed. Over the mattress would be laid sheets made of linen, which was the standard material for bedding in the 18th century. Cotton sheets existed but were expensive and relatively rare. Linen sheets were smooth, cool when first laid down, and would become warmed by body heat as the night progressed. Over the sheets would be a blanket or blankets made of wool or other materials. A coverlet or quilt might provide additional warmth. In winter, the bedclothes would be substantial, necessary for maintaining warmth in unheated or minimally heated bedrooms. In summer, fewer layers might be used, though even in summer there would typically be a sheet and some kind of covering. The pillows would be filled with feathers or down, covered with linen cases. There might be one pillow or multiple pillows depending on the person's preference and the resources available. Washington, as a person of means, would likely have had good quality bedding, though what we would consider comfortable or luxurious by modern standards would not have been the case. The bed would have been an island of relative comfort in a generally uncomfortable physical environment. The bedroom itself, the space where this bed sits, would be a variable environment depending on the season. In winter, the bedroom would be quite cold unless it had a fireplace, and if it had one, that fireplace would need to be kept supplied with fuel and regularly tended. The cost of heating multiple bedrooms was substantial, and often only the main living areas of a house would be regularly heated. Bedrooms, particularly in the northern colonies and states, would be quite cold at night, and sleep would be sought under substantial bedclothes. In summer, the bedroom would be warmer and the windows might be open to allow air circulation, though this would also allow insects to enter. The darkness in the bedroom would be profound. Without any artificial light sources, the room would be completely black, except for whatever moonlight or starlight might penetrate through the windows. In complete darkness, the other senses become more prominent. Sounds become louder, more noticeable. Smells become more apparent. Physical sensations become more acute. For someone settling into bed in the darkness, the environment would be an entirely sensory experience, without the visual information that we rely on so heavily in modern life. Sleep and its challenges the question of whether George Washington slept well, and what sleep meant to him, is something we can only partially answer from a historical distance. We know from his writings that he sometimes experienced insomnia, or what he would have called restlessness or sleeplessness. We know that he took his sleep seriously, that he understood it as important to his health and well-being. We know that he was a person of habit, and he appears to have had fairly regular sleep patterns, retiring at a consistent time and rising at a consistent time. The sleep of the 18th century was different from modern sleep in ways that historians and sleep researchers have become increasingly interested in. Before the widespread use of electricity and electric lighting, human sleep patterns were different. The natural sleep of humans, when not interrupted by artificial constraints, appears to be biphasic, that is, consisting of two distinct periods of sleep separated by an interval of wakefulness. This pattern, documented in pre-industrial societies and in modern experimental conditions, was apparently normal in the 18th century and before. The practice was apparently to go to bed for several hours, sleep until midnight or shortly after, awaken, remain awake for an hour or two, and then return to sleep. During this interval of wakefulness, a person might read, pray, reflect, have a quiet conversation with a bedmate, or simply lie awake thinking. This was called the first sleep and the second sleep, and references to this pattern appear throughout historical literature of the period. Whether Washington practiced this pattern, we cannot know with certainty, but it was a common structure for sleep in his era. If Washington did experience this pattern, then the interval of wakefulness would have been a particular kind of quiet time. The household would be mostly dark and silent. His mind, not yet fully settled into sleep, would be active. This would be a time for reflection, for thinking through problems, for prayer if he was inclined to pray, for the kind of internal conversation that happens in the quiet hours of the night. It would have been a solitary time, undisturbed by the demands of the day or the presence of other people who needed his attention. The physical experience of sleep in the 18th century would have been different from modern sleep in other ways as well. The sounds of the night, the small sounds of the house settling, the wind outside, the distant sounds of animals would have been a constant backdrop. The temperature would have been cooler than modern bedrooms as heating was minimal. The air might have been less clean depending on ventilation. The quality of the mattress and bedding, while good for the time, would not have provided the support and comfort of modern sleeping surfaces. The absence of the constant sensory stimulation of modern life, the absence of the low hum of electricity, the complete absence of any form of artificial light would have created a very different sensory environment for sleep. Washington's own sleep would have been shaped by his particular circumstances and concerns. If he was troubled about something, political developments or family matters or agricultural concerns, these thoughts would not have disappeared simply because he lay down to sleep. The mind continues its work in the hours of sleep, processing information, working through problems, sometimes creating dreams that reflect the preoccupations of the day. The sleep of someone who carries significant responsibility, someone whose mind is habitually active, is often less restful than it might be. The physical ailments that troubled Washington would have affected his sleep as well. Joint pain, if present, would have made finding a comfortable position difficult. Dental pain, which we know troubled him chronically, might have been worse in the lying position, particularly if he had an abscess or infection. Digestive troubles would have made sleep uncomfortable. The normal processes of aging which Washington was experiencing in his retirement years often bring changes to sleep patterns, making sleep lighter, more fragmented, less restorative. In the darkness of the bedroom, with the world outside quiet, sleep would have come and gone in patterns that Washington understood as normal. He would have slept, perhaps restlessly, perhaps deeply, depending on the night. He would have awakened as people do multiple times during the night. These awakenings might have been brief, returning to sleep quickly, or they might have been extended, creating those periods of wakefulness that seem to have been normal in the sleep pattern of the era. The dreams that came during sleep are something we can only speculate about. Do the dreams of people in one era differ from the dreams of people in another? Or are dreams more fundamental, more connected to the deep structures of the mind, less affected by the particular culture or era? We cannot say. But we can imagine that Washington, like all people, would have dreamed. The dreams might have been mundane, reflecting the daily experiences and concerns. They might have been symbolic, working through psychological material. They might have been physical sensations, the body speaking to the mind through the language of dreams. One thing we can say with some confidence is that Washington was aware of sleep as important. He understood that his health depended on adequate rest. He took steps to promote sleep when it was difficult to achieve. He recognized that the quality of his life, his ability to function, his ability to manage his responsibilities, all depended on his ability to sleep reasonably well. In this, he was not different from people of any era. Sleep is fundamental. Without it, the mind and body deteriorate. With adequate sleep, the world becomes more bearable. The night is long and sleep is not always present throughout that night. Sometimes it comes easily, a curtain of darkness descending quickly and hours pass as if minutes. Sometimes it is elusive, the mind remaining active, the body restless, the night seeming to stretch endlessly. Washington would have experienced both kinds of nights, as all people do. The intellectual world at night, even as we speak of sleep and rest, we must acknowledge that the evening and night hours for George Washington were not exclusively dedicated to sleep. They were also significantly hours of intellectual engagement. Washington was a man who valued knowledge, who read extensively, who thought carefully about the world and his place in it. The evening hours, particularly in retirement when his responsibilities were somewhat diminished, would have provided time for this kind of intellectual work. What would Washington have been reading in the evening hours? This is something we can partially answer because we have records of the books he owned, and we have references in his papers to the things he was reading at various points in his life. Washington was interested in practical matters, in agriculture, in military science, in engineering and design. He read books about farming, about crop rotation, about new techniques and tools. He read classical works of literature and philosophy. He read histories and biographies. He read contemporary political writing and theory. The act of reading by candlelight in the 18th century was different from modern reading. The light was limited, creating eye strain over time. The pace was slower, partly because the light was less bright, partly because the culture of reading was different. People read differently in that era, with greater attention to individual passages, more likely to reread, more likely to pause and reflect on what they were reading. The reading was often done aloud, particularly in social settings. Though Washington, reading alone in his chamber in the evening, would have been reading silently, presumably. One work that Washington is known to have read and apparently valued was the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher. The Meditations are a work of personal reflection, philosophical musing, and ethical consideration, and they seem to have resonated with Washington. The Stoic philosophy, with its emphasis on duty, on the management of emotions, on acceptance of what cannot be changed, and on virtue as the highest good, aligns with what we know of Washington's own philosophy and his approach to life. Reading these reflections in the quiet of evening, the flickering light of candles illuminating the pages, Washington would have been engaging with ideas that attempted to provide guidance for how to live a good life, how to bear responsibility with equanimity, how to accept the things that are beyond one's control. Washington was also interested in scientific and technical matters. The 18th century was an era of enlightenment, of scientific advancement, and Washington was aware of these developments. He had interests in engineering, in the design and construction of buildings and systems. He was interested in agriculture in a scientific sense, in experimentation and improvement. He read about these matters, attempted to apply what he learned to his own work and property. The reading of his retirement years might have taken on a particular character. Having stepped back from the immediate pressures of political office, Washington might have had more time to engage with the more philosophical and reflective works. The questions of how to live well, how to be useful in the world without holding office, what constitutes a good life, these seem to have become more present in his thinking during his retirement. Beyond reading, the evening and night hours could also be spent in other forms of intellectual work. Washington kept detailed records of his plantation, accounting for expenses, yield, and various matters of management. He might spend evening hours reviewing these records, planning improvements, thinking through agricultural problems. He corresponded extensively, and letters required thought and care. Writing a letter to a friend or family member or to a person seeking his advice or intercession required composing thoughts, considering how to express oneself, ensuring clarity and appropriateness. The intellectual work of managing a large plantation, even in retirement, was substantial. Water systems, soil management, crop selection, animal breeding, the care of buildings and equipment, all of these required thought and planning. Washington's approach to these matters was systematic and careful. He read about improvements being made elsewhere, thought about how they might apply to Mount Vernon, conducted experiments, and kept records of the results. This was intellectual work, but it was grounded in practical necessity. The mind of George Washington, insofar as we can discern it from the historical record, was active and engaged. The evening hours, rather than being a time of complete rest and disengagement, were often hours of continued engagement with ideas and problems. The pace might be slower, the engagement more reflective, but the mind was engaged. There is a particular quality to intellectual work done in the evening hours, by candlelight in a quiet study, with the world outside fallen into darkness and silence. The work of the mind becomes more prominent when the sensory input from the external world is reduced. The thoughts become more available, more accessible. Ideas can be pursued more deeply. Reflection can be more sustained. Washington, settling into his study in the evening, moving past the social and physical demands of the day, would have been entering a space where his own thoughts and ideas could come to the foreground. It is also possible that Washington sometimes simply sat without reading or writing, without any particular external focus. He might have gazed into a fire if there was one in the study. He might have looked out the window into the darkness. He might have allowed his mind to wander, to follow the patterns of thought that arise when the will is not directing the attention toward a specific task. This kind of aimless reflection, what we might now call meditation, though Washington would not have used that term, might have been a source of rest and contemplation for him. The balance between activity and rest, between engagement and disengagement, would have been something Washington navigated through the evening hours. He was a man of action and duty, of constant responsibility, but even he needed periods of quieter engagement, times when the demands on him were less pressing. The evening hours, particularly in retirement, could provide those periods. Solitude and reflection in darkness as the night deepens and grows later, as the candles burn lower and are gradually extinguished throughout the house, the world becomes increasingly dark and silent. The household has mostly settled to sleep. The servants have completed their tasks. The animals have quieted. The wind may continue, the river may continue its endless sound, but the activity of human beings has largely ceased. Washington, if he is awake at this hour, is in a state of profound solitude. The solitude is not the absence of other people, though the house is full of people, some sleeping nearby, some in different parts of the large structure. The solitude is the absence of demand, of expectation, of the need to perform a role or to maintain an image. This is a particular kind of solitude that comes in the late night hours, a psychological and emotional solitude even in the midst of physical proximity to others. What thoughts might occupy such hours? What does the mind of George Washington do when freed from the immediate demands of managing an estate, managing people, maintaining the appearance and performance of his role? We can only speculate, but we can make educated speculations based on what we know of him, what he wrote, what he seems to have cared about. Washington, by the accounts of those who knew him, was not a man given to excessive introspection or emotional display. He maintained an external composure. He was formal in manner, but beneath this external reserve there seems to have been an active inner life. His letters, even the formal ones intended for wider readership, occasionally revealed glimpses of a mind that was troubled, reflective, concerned with questions of meaning and purpose. In the quiet of the late evening or early morning, with no one watching, with no need to maintain an image, Washington might have allowed himself to dwell on concerns that he could not fully express to others. The question of slavery, which he lived with and which seems to have troubled him, but which he did not move decisively to address, might have occupied his thoughts. The choices he had made during his presidency, the things he had supported and the things he had opposed, the paths not taken, these might have come to mind. The state of his health, the awareness of aging, the finite nature of his own existence, these thoughts would come to most people in the quiet hours of the night. Washington was also a man of his time, shaped by the thought and philosophy of the 18th century. The Enlightenment values of reason, order, and virtue would have been incorporated into his thinking. He would have believed, or tried to believe, in the importance of duty, in the subordination of personal desire to the greater good, in the necessity of bearing one's responsibilities with steadiness and resolve. But living according to these principles, while also being a human being with human emotions and human vulnerabilities, is a constant struggle. The evening hours might have been when that struggle became more apparent, when the maintenance of the philosophical stance became more difficult. The awareness of one's own mortality, which comes to everyone but which seems to become more acute in the hours of darkness and solitude, was likely present for Washington in these hours. He was aging. He had lived a long and full life by the standards of his era. He had accomplished much. But he was also aware that his time was finite, that the future was not guaranteed, that the present moment was fleeting. This awareness, which can be depressing or which can be clarifying depending on one's philosophy and one's mood, would have been a part of the texture of these dark hours. The practice of reflection, of examining one's own life and thoughts, was valued in the philosophical and religious traditions that influenced Washington. Stoicism encouraged such reflection. Christianity encouraged examination of conscience. The culture of the 18th century, particularly among educated men, valued the life of the mind, the capacity for abstract thought and philosophical reflection. Washington might have engaged in this kind of reflection in the evening hours, thinking about his life, his choices, his beliefs. But equally, he might have been occupied with more mundane concerns. Is there a draft coming from that window? Is that a leak I noticed in the roof earlier something I should address? What should we plant in that field next season? Did I adequately address that matter of concern in my letter, or should I write again? The mind does not restrict itself to the profound. It moves between the trivial and the significant, sometimes within the space of moments. The silence of the night, the darkness, the solitude, these create a particular condition for human consciousness. The constant input from the external world is diminished. The demands of social interaction are absent. The need to accomplish tasks is reduced. In this condition, the mind can wander in ways it cannot during the day. Thoughts arise more readily. Emotions that are suppressed during busy waking hours may emerge. Memories may surface, forgotten moments from the past, conversations from years ago, moments of joy or regret. For Washington, the memories would have been extensive. He had lived through significant historical moments. He had known many people of prominence and importance. He had made decisions that shaped the course of the nation. He had also certainly had ordinary human experiences, moments of pleasure and pain, of success and failure, of connection and disappointment. All of these might come to mind in the quiet darkness. The experience of solitude itself, the simple fact of being alone with one's own thoughts with no external distraction, is something that is less common in the modern world than it was in Washington's time. We have so many devices to distract ourselves, so many ways to avoid being alone with ourselves, so many voices clamoring for our attention. Washington, in the darkness of his chamber, would have had to face himself, his own thoughts, his own consciousness, without the distraction of external input. What did he think about? We can only imagine. But the questions he might have asked himself are universal questions. Have I lived well? Have I done what I ought to have done? What will I be remembered for? What does my life mean? Are there things I should have done differently? Is there still time to correct mistakes, to address injustices, to move toward what is right? These are the kinds of questions that the darkness of night seems to call forth, the kinds of questions that are easier to avoid during the busy day but which insist on being asked when the day is done and the world has quieted. The physical environment of night let us move closer to the actual physical reality of Washington's evening environment, the sensory experience of being in Mount Vernon in the dark hours. The temperature inside the house, particularly in the bedroom where Washington might be sleeping or resting, would be cool. Modern houses are kept at a constant, comfortable temperature throughout. 18th century houses were not. In winter, the bedroom would be significantly colder than the main living areas of the house. The heat from a fireplace, if there was one, would dissipate quickly into the high ceiling and the large space. In summer, the bedroom would be warm and the windows might be open to allow some air circulation, though this would also allow insects to enter. The air itself would have a different quality. Modern air is often filtered and cleaned, humidified or dehumidified to a certain level. 18th century air was unfiltered. It would carry various smells and particles from the environment. In a house with fireplaces, there would be the smell of smoke, at least faintly. In a house with candles burning, there would be the smell of tallow or whale oil, depending on the quality of the candles. There would be the smell of the human body, of skin and breath and the various fluids that the human body produces. There would be the smell of the textiles, the bedding and curtains and clothing, which would have their own accumulated odors. For a modern person stepping into an 18th century bedroom, the smell would be notably different. The combination of various organic smells, the lack of modern cleaning products with their particular chemical scents, the presence of smoke and candle wax, all of this would create a sensory environment quite unlike what we are accustomed to. Washington, having never known any other environment, would have perceived this as simply the normal smell of a room. It would have been unremarkable to him. The sounds of the night would have been very different as well. In a modern house, even without any active noise sources, there is a background hum from electrical devices, from the operation of heating and cooling systems, from the ambient noise of the world outside. An 18th century house at night with no electrical devices, with a fire in the fireplace perhaps, would have been much quieter, but it would not have been silent. The house itself would have had various sounds, the creaking and settling of wood as temperatures changed throughout the night. The movement of rats or mice in the walls, which was a common problem in houses of the era. The occasional sound of a servant or family member moving through the house, their footsteps audible in the darkness. If there was wind outside, it would be heard moving through trees, pressing against the walls and windows of the house, occasionally creating drafts that would move through the interior. Outside the house, the sounds would have been those of a landscape not yet altered by industrial activity. There would have been the sound of the river, which was never silent, the water moving constantly, the sound changing with the season and the weather. There would have been the sounds of animals, many of which are active at night, frogs, insects, the occasional owl or other night bird. In the distance, perhaps the sound of other animals, the howl of a wolf or the sound of a fox, predators that still existed in Virginia in the 18th century, though they were becoming less common as the landscape became more settled. The quality of darkness was absolute and profound. Modern darkness is rarely truly dark. There are always some light sources, some glow on the horizon from civilization, perhaps a streetlight or a nearby house. An 18th century night away from any town would have been completely dark, except for the light of stars or moon if the sky was clear. If the sky was cloudy, the darkness would have been nearly complete, broken only by the faintest possibility of a glow from a window of the house. In such darkness, the other senses become more prominent. The ability to navigate depended on memory and touch rather than sight. The sounds of the night become louder and more noticeable. The smell of the environment becomes more apparent. The physical sensations, the feel of the air on the skin, the feel of the bed beneath the body, these become more acute when the eyes cannot gather information. For someone lying in bed in this environment, the experience would be quite different from modern sleep. The darkness would be more complete. The silence would be more profound, though not absolute. The connection to the natural environment, to the rhythms of day and night, to the sounds and smells of the living world would be more direct and more constant. Washington's body, lying in the darkness, would be aware of the coolness of the night air, the warmth of the bedclothes, the hard surface of the mattress beneath him. He might be aware of his own heartbeat, of his own breathing, of the various sensations that the body produces when attention is turned inward. He would be aware of the sounds of the night, which might be sleep-inducing or might be disruptive depending on their nature and his state of mind. The passage of time in the darkness of night seems to follow different rules than the passage of time during the day. Minutes seem to stretch. An hour of wakefulness in the middle of the night seems to last longer than an hour of wakefulness during the day. This is partly psychological and partly physiological, having to do with the different state of consciousness that nighttime produces. If Washington was awake, if he was experiencing that interval of wakefulness that seems to have been normal for sleep in his era, the passage of time would have had this quality of extension. The hours would seem long. His thoughts would be available in a way they might not be during the busy day. The environment around him, the sounds and smells and physical sensations, would be the entirety of his sensory world. The care of the body and remedies, we must now turn to the question of medical care and health management in the evening hours, because this was a significant part of Washington's experience, particularly in his later years. The medicine of the 18th century was, by modern standards, quite limited and often ineffective or harmful. The understanding of disease was incomplete. The tools for treatment were crude. Many conditions that are now easily cured or managed were then incurable and could only be managed through palliative care. And yet people of the era took their health seriously. They sought out physicians. They followed medical advice. They used remedies and treatments meant to address their ailments. George Washington was particularly attentive to health matters. He read medical literature. He consulted with physicians. He kept records of his illnesses and treatments. He was aware of his body and its workings in a way that suggests he was concerned about his health and sought to manage it actively. The specific ailments that troubled Washington in his evening hours would have included joint pain, which increased with age. His hands and feet and various joints would have been subject to what was probably gout or arthritis, conditions that cause pain and stiffness, particularly in the morning and evening hours. The pain would have been managed through various treatments. Warm water or warm oils might have been applied to affected joints. Liniments made from various herbs and animal fats might have been rubbed into the skin. Wraps or bandages might have been applied for support and warmth. The dental problems that plagued Washington throughout his life would have been a source of pain and discomfort in the evening hours. The teeth that remained might have been aching. The dentures he wore would have been uncomfortable, particularly by evening after hours of wear. The pain associated with these dental problems, which would have been chronic and persistent, would have been something Washington simply had to endure, as there were no effective pain medications available for long-term use, and even the palliative measures available were limited. For various ailments, including pain and fever and general malaise, the medications available to Washington would have included herbal preparations. Willow bark contains salicylic acid and would have had some pain-relieving effects. Various herbs and plant materials were prepared into teas or tinctures. Some of these might have had genuine medicinal value, others were likely ineffective, and some might have been actively harmful, introducing toxins into the body or interfering with the body's own healing processes. The use of bloodletting, the practice of removing blood from a patient as a cure for various ailments, was still common in the 18th century, though it was beginning to fall out of favor among more progressive physicians. The theory was that disease was caused by an imbalance of humors and that removing blood would restore balance. The practice was traumatic and in most cases counterproductive, but it was still widely practiced. If Washington was treated by a physician who subscribed to these theories, he might have been subjected to bloodletting. Beyond these specific medical treatments, there would have been practices meant to promote general health and rest. Warmth was considered beneficial. A warm drink before bed, such as warm milk or warm ale, was thought to promote sleep and maintain warmth during the night. Various dietary practices were thought to affect health. The avoidance of certain foods, the consumption of others, the time of eating, all of these were believed to matter. Sleep itself was understood as essential to health. The theory of humors, while not correct in its specifics, recognized that the body needed rest and recovery time. Adequate sleep was recommended as treatment for various ailments. The assumption was that during sleep the body could heal and recover. The quality of sleep was understood to matter. Disturbed sleep, restless sleep, was understood as harmful. Peaceful, uninterrupted sleep was considered beneficial. This understanding would have made Washington attentive to his sleep. If he was experiencing insomnia, if he was having trouble sleeping, he would have understood this as a health problem and would have sought to address it. The various preparations and practices meant to promote sleep, the warm drinks, the particular preparations made from herbs, the practices meant to keep the body warm and the environment calm, all of these would have been understood as health care. The evening hours, as Washington prepared for sleep, would have included attention to health. The body would be assessed for any particular ailments that needed attention. Remedies would be applied. The conditions for sleep would be arranged. The whole process would be understood as an important part of maintaining health. Washington lived in an era before germ theory, before the understanding of disease caused by bacteria and viruses. Disease was understood as arising from imbalances or from the inhalation of bad air, miasma as it was called. The treatment was often general rather than specific. Keeping warm, maintaining good air, eating well, sleeping adequately, all of these were understood as ways to maintain health and to promote recovery from illness. The particular pain and discomfort that Washington experienced would have been a constant concern. The management of this pain, through whatever means were available, would have been part of his evening routine. And the desire for relief, for the body to be comfortable, for sleep to come and provide rest, would have been a powerful motivation driving his evening preparations. Solitude and reflection in late HOURS. As the night deepens further, as the hours move past midnight and toward the hours before dawn, the world takes on a particular quality. The traffic through the household has largely ceased. Even the servants and enslaved people who maintain the house have mostly retired to their own sleeping areas. The sounds of human activity have diminished to nearly nothing. The sounds of the natural world continue, the river, the wind, the occasional animal sound, but the human presence is subdued. If Washington is awake at this hour, lying in bed or perhaps sitting by a banked fire if he cannot sleep, he would be in a state of profound solitude. The solitude would be both literal and psychological. There is no one to see him, no one to whom he needs to present an image. There is no role to play, no performance to maintain. He is simply a man alone with his own thoughts, his own body, his own consciousness. The awareness of the night hours, the particular quality of consciousness that comes in the depth of night, is something that has fascinated human beings across centuries. The philosopher wrote of the distinction between the night mind and the day mind. The night is a time when different thoughts come, when the barriers between the conscious and unconscious seem to thin, when emotions and insights that are suppressed during the day rise to the surface. For Washington, the night hours might have been a time of particular honesty. The things he could not say to others, the concerns he could not express publicly, the doubts he might have about his own choices and actions, these might come to mind in the depths of night. The weight of responsibility which he had borne for so long might feel different in the darkness and silence. The awareness of mortality, which seems to come more readily in the deep hours of night, would have been present. Washington was aware in his late 60s that he would not live forever. The question of legacy, of what he would be remembered for, what his life would mean after his death, these questions might have occupied his mind. The Stoic philosophy he seems to have valued taught that death was natural and inevitable, and that the wise man should accept it with equanimity. But acceptance and absence of fear are not the same thing. The human animal is programmed to resist death, and this programming would have been active even in a philosophically sophisticated man like Washington. The night hours, for someone who is awake and reflective, can be a time of clarity or a time of distress, depending on the state of mind and the specific concerns that occupy the mind. For someone who is struggling with a difficult decision, the night hours might bring new perspectives, might illuminate aspects of the problem that were not visible during the day. For someone who is anxious, the night hours might exacerbate the anxiety as the mind chews over problems without the distraction of activity. Washington in the night hours might have found himself returning to questions that occupied him. The question of slavery, which he lived with and which he knew was wrong, but which he did not move decisively to address or to dismantle. The question of his legacy, of what he had built and whether it was adequate, whether it would endure. The question of his own nature, his own emotional landscape, which he kept largely hidden but which might come to the surface in the privacy of the night. He might have reflected on moments from his past, conversations that came back to him, decisions that seemed in retrospect to have been mistakes, opportunities that had been missed. He might have wondered about people he had known, about their lives and their fates. He might have been preoccupied with the immediate concerns of Mount Vernon, with the problems that required solutions, with the details of management that occupied so much of his attention. The night hours are a time when the mind can range more freely, when logic and reason, which tend to dominate the daytime mind, give way somewhat to emotion, intuition, memory, and imagination. For a man like Washington, who was trained to maintain control over his emotional expression, who believed in the power of reason and the necessity of duty, the night hours might have been a time when these constraints relaxed slightly. The feelings that were controlled during the day might have more freedom to exist, to be acknowledged if not acted upon. The darkness itself might have been comforting or might have been isolating, depending on Washington's state of mind. Darkness can feel protective, a veil against observation, a place to hide. Darkness can also feel lonely, can emphasize separation, can make the person alone in the darkness feel even more isolated. For someone like Washington, who was habitually formal and reserved, the darkness might have been a relief, a place where he did not have to maintain the mask of authority. The practice of reflection, of examining one's own life and consciousness, was valued in the traditions that influenced Washington. The Stoic philosophers engaged in what they called the view from above, a practice of stepping outside oneself mentally and viewing one's own life from a distance, as if one were looking down from above at one's own existence. This practice was meant to create perspective, to diminish the sense of personal importance while also clarifying what mattered most. Washington might have engaged in something like this in the quiet hours of night, using his philosophy to help him understand his life and his place in the world. The approach of dawn as the night hours continue and imperceptibly shift toward morning, there comes a point where the darkness begins to change character. This is not a sudden change. The sun has not yet risen. There is no visible light in the eastern sky, but the darkness becomes less absolute. The stars fade slightly as the sky begins its slow transition from the deepest night to the darkness that precedes dawn. For someone who has been awake through much of the night, or who wakes as the dawn approaches, this shift in the quality of darkness is noticeable. The sounds of the night begin to change. The chorus of frogs and insects, which has been constant through the night, begins to diminish. The birds, which have been silent, begin to stir. The first birds to sing are often just barely audible, single notes and calls that seem tentative, testing the coming of dawn. If Washington wakes at this hour, if he finds himself conscious in the period before sunrise, he would notice these changes. The temperature would remain cool, perhaps even becoming slightly cooler as the night releases its hold on the land. The air would still be dark. The windows of his bedroom would still reveal nothing of the outside world, only darkness visible in the glass. But there would be a sense, subtle but real, of transition, of the approach of the morning. The practice of rising before sunrise was common in the 18th century. Without electric light, there was less incentive to stay awake after dark than there is in modern times. Rising with or before the dawn was natural. Sunrise came at different times depending on the season. In winter in Virginia, sunrise would not come until after 7 o'clock in the morning. In summer, sunrise would come before 5 o'clock. Washington's sleep schedule, if he kept one, would have been affected by these seasonal variations. If Washington had experienced that pattern of biphasic sleep, with waking in the middle of the night followed by a return to sleep, he would now be approaching the time when he would sleep again in the second sleep. The mind and body, having rested during the first sleep, having been awake for an hour or two, would be ready to return to sleep. The approaching dawn would not have made this difficult. Even the coming daylight would not prevent sleep. People would sleep through dawn and into morning if they needed rest, if their schedule allowed. But if Washington was not planning to sleep further, if he was preparing to rise with the dawn, the approaching morning would have a different character. There would be a sense of the night ending, of the day beginning, of the return to the active world. The consciousness would begin to shift, preparing for the demands of the day, for the need to arise and to engage with the business of the plantation and the household. The space between night and day, the twilight zone of the early morning, is a particular kind of consciousness. The sleep of night is being left behind, but the full wakefulness of day has not yet arrived. The mind is in a transitional state. Thoughts and insights that came in the night begin to fade. The concerns of the day begin to emerge. The body begins its preparations for activity, slowly increasing heart rate, beginning the process of warming up. If there was a fire in the bedroom, it would have been banked the night before, the coals covered with ash to slow the burning and conserve fuel. At this hour, the fire would still be alive beneath the ash. A servant might come to the room in the early morning to open the fire, to add fresh fuel, to restore it to a state where it could warm the room as the morning progressed. This would be one of the first sounds of activity in the house, the sound of a servant entering the room quietly, tending to the fire and leaving again. Washington himself, if he was rising, would begin the physical process of getting out of bed. This was not a simple matter, particularly for someone with joint pain and other physical ailments. The body would be stiff from lying in bed. The joints would need to move gradually. The process of rising would have involved moving to a sitting position first, then swinging the legs over the side of the bed, then pushing oneself up to standing. Each of these movements would have had implications for the body, would have felt different from how they feel for a younger or healthier person. The cold of the morning, the chill of the room in the early hours would be noticeable once the warmth of the bedclothes was left behind. The air would be cool, the floor would be cold beneath the feet. This would add impetus to the process of dressing, of getting clothes on, of moving toward a source of warmth, whether that was a fire or the physical activity of beginning the day. The first light of dawn, if Washington went to a window, would reveal a landscape in transition. The darkness would be diminishing, but the sun would still not be above the horizon. The sky to the east would show the first signs of light, a gradual brightening that would increase slowly. The landscape would emerge from darkness into visibility, the trees becoming distinct shapes, the river becoming visible in the distance, the buildings and fields of Mount Vernon becoming visible in the emerging light. The return of daylight would bring a return to the visual world, to the ability to see clearly, to perceive color and detail. The shift from night to day is profound, not just in the quality of light, but in the entire character of consciousness and perception. The night mind gives way to the day mind. The reflection and introspection possible in darkness gives way to the activity and engagement possible in light. The ending of night and the beginning of day, the moment of sunrise, when the sun finally clears the horizon and its light floods across the landscape, marks a definitive shift. The night is over. The day has begun. The entire character of the world changes. The landscape that was dark becomes light. The sounds that dominated the night, the frogs and insects, diminish as the daytime animals become active. The air itself seems to change, though this is partly perception and partly actual changes in air movement and temperature. For Washington, whether he is watching the sunrise or has already begun the business of the day, the night hours have ended. The time of solitude and reflection, the time when the demands of the day are suspended, the time when the self is fully present without the need to perform a role, this time has passed. The day brings with it the return of responsibility, of the need to manage the estate, to tend to the various concerns of the plantation and the household, to engage with other people and with the wider world. It is tempting to view the night hours as a time of rest and recuperation, and in many ways they are. But they are also a time when the inner life, the consciousness, the depth of the self becomes more present. The night is when the defenses are down, when the public persona is less necessary, when the authentic self has more freedom to exist. In sleep, the conscious control is relinquished. In wakefulness during the night, there is often a particular kind of honesty, a diminishment of the need to pretend or to perform. The return of daylight brings a return to external reality, to the visible world, to the demands of managing a life and a property. This is necessary and important. The business of living, the practical work that keeps a household and a plantation functioning, cannot be accomplished in darkness. The daylight is essential. But it also brings a return to the constraints and performances that are required when we are in the presence of others, when we are the object of observation, when our actions and words have implications beyond the purely personal. Washington's day would have begun with the business of the plantation and the household. There would have been inspections to make, decisions to be taken, people to speak with. The ease of the evening hours, the possibility of relaxation and reflection would be suspended. The weight of responsibility would return. The mask of authority would need to be put on again. But the night hours, even though they have ended and are now in the past, remain as an experience. They have happened. They have changed something in the person who lived through them. The reflections of night do not simply disappear because daylight has returned. They may not be consciously present during the busy day. They may not affect the immediate decisions and actions. But they remain as an influence, shaping the consciousness, affecting the perspective from which the day is lived. The cycle of day and night, the movement from the world of action and external reality into the world of solitude and internal reality, and back again, is a fundamental rhythm of human existence. It is a rhythm that Washington would have experienced every night of his life. The particular importance of this rhythm, the necessity of both the activity of day and the rest of night, would have been understood by someone who lived entirely without electric light. The night hours have provided a space for consciousness to move freely, for reflection to occur, for the deeper aspects of the self to become more present. The day hours provide a space for the self to engage with the world, to accomplish tasks, to participate in the social fabric of life. Both are necessary. Both shape the human experience. The alternation between them across all the nights and days of a lifetime is the fundamental pattern of human existence. Recurring themes and deeper patterns now. As we move into the deeper hours of our narrative, let us pause and consider some of the themes and patterns that have woven through our exploration of Washington's night and evening hours. These themes are not unique to Washington. They are universal patterns that appear in human life across centuries and cultures. But they take particular form in the specific life and era of this particular man. The first of these themes is the tension between responsibility and rest. Washington carried enormous responsibility. He was not simply a private individual managing his own affairs. He was a public figure of immense importance. The nation that he had helped to create was still finding its footing. Political conflicts were emerging. International relations were complex and fragile. Even in retirement, Washington remained engaged with these concerns. The question of how to rest, how to achieve genuine peace and restoration when the mind remains engaged with concerns of such magnitude, is something Washington would have struggled with. The second theme is the tension between the public and the private self. In the day, Washington was the man of authority, the general, the president, the master of the estate. His manner was formal. His words were carefully chosen. His actions were observed and interpreted. In the evening and night hours, he could be simply a man without the weight of these external expectations. But the shift between these modes of being is not simple. The habits of the public self do not simply disappear because the audience is gone. The internal state of being formed by years of having to maintain an image does not instantly relax. The third theme is the passage of time and the awareness of mortality. Washington was aging. He knew that his time was finite. The evening and night hours, particularly for an aging person, can bring a particular awareness of this finiteness. The time that passes cannot be recovered. The things left undone will not be done. The people lost will not return. The awareness of these facts can be clarifying. It can also be distressing. Washington's engagement with this awareness, conscious or unconscious, shapes his evening hours. The fourth theme is the quest for understanding and meaning. Washington was an intelligent man, engaged with ideas, reading philosophy and history, trying to understand the world and his place in it. The evening hours, the time away from immediate demands, provided space for this quest. The questions of what made a good life, what constituted virtue, what was the purpose of human existence, these questions did not have final answers. But the wrestling with them, the continued engagement with them, was part of what made Washington's life his own. The fifth theme is the management of pain and discomfort. Washington lived in a body that was not always comfortable. Physical pain was a regular part of his experience. The evening hours were a time when pain might be more noticeable, when the body's demands might be more insistent. The various remedies and practices meant to address pain, to promote comfort and sleep, would have been part of his routine. The constant negotiation between the body's demands and the mind's plans is a theme throughout human existence, and for Washington in his later years, this negotiation would have been particularly active. The sixth theme is the solitude and the social connection. Even though the household at Mount Vernon was full of people, the evening and night hours provided a particular kind of solitude. In this solitude, Washington could be fully himself. But solitude and social connection are both necessary for human well-being. The balance between them, the movement between the social day and the solitary evening, shapes the quality of life. Washington's engagement with this balance, his need for both engagement and solitude, would have influenced how he spent his evening and night hours. These themes, which are universal but which take particular form in Washington's life and time, create a texture to his evening and night experience. They are the deep currents beneath the surface of the observable actions and routines. They shape how the body feels in bed, what the mind thinks about in the darkness, what the heart experiences in the moment of wakefulness in the depth of night. Seasonal variations and the changing night, the night hours that we have been exploring, would have been different depending on the season. Mount Vernon and the surrounding area of Virginia experienced genuine seasons, with significant variation in temperature, daylight hours, and the natural environment. The experience of evening and night would have been quite different in winter than in summer. In winter in the Virginia Piedmont, darkness comes early. By 5 o'clock in the evening, night has largely fallen. The daylight hours are short, only about 9 hours at the winter solstice. This means that the evening and night hours extend quite long. Washington might have retired for sleep relatively early in the evening, as there was nothing else to do in the darkness except sleep or to engage in activities that could be done by candlelight, which was a limited set of activities and an expensive proposition in terms of candles. The cold of a Virginia winter would have been significant. Snow would fall sometimes, though Virginia winters are not as harsh as winters further north. The nights would have been very cold, the bedroom quite chill, the bedclothes necessary for warmth. The journey from bed to chamber pot, from bed to washing stand, from bed to anywhere outside the warmth of the bedclothes would have been unpleasant. The motivation to leave the bed would have been minimal. The motivation to return quickly would have been strong. In summer, by contrast, darkness comes late. At the summer solstice in Virginia, the sun rises before 5 in the morning and does not set until after 8 in the evening. The daylight hours are long, extended, allowing for much more work to be done outside and much more outdoor activity in general. The evening hours, when darkness finally comes, would be relatively brief. The night would be short. By 5 or 6 in the morning, dawn would be breaking and the day would be well underway by 7 or 8. The heat of a summer night in Virginia would be noticeable. The daytime temperatures can reach the 90s or higher. The cooling that comes with nightfall would be welcome. But even with nightfall, the temperature would remain warm and sleeping would require only minimal covering. The windows would likely be open to allow air circulation, though this would allow insects to enter. The balance between air circulation and insect prevention would have been a constant negotiation. The quality of the darkness would have been different in summer and winter as well. In summer, with the brief darkness lasting only a few hours, the sky would not become as deeply dark as in winter. In winter, with long nights and the potential for cloud cover, the darkness could be quite profound and extensive. The sounds of the night would have varied seasonally as well. The chorus of frogs and insects is more active in warm months. Different birds are present in different seasons. The movement of animals would vary. In winter, the absence of many animals and insects would make the night quieter. In summer, the night would be filled with sounds. The experience of Washington settling into his evening routine would have been affected by these seasonal variations. In winter, the evening might come quite early and the day would have ended by 4 or 5 o'clock. In summer, the work of the day might extend later into the evening, with sunset coming after 8. The dinner hour might be earlier or later depending on the season. The bedtime might be earlier in winter and later in summer. The health effects of the seasons would also have mattered. Winter cold could exacerbate joint pain. The damp of spring could trouble respiratory systems. The heat of summer could be debilitating for someone with certain conditions. The different seasons would have brought different challenges to someone managing chronic health issues. The psychological effects of the seasons would have been real as well. The brief darkness and long daylight of summer can be psychologically energizing. The long darkness and brief daylight of winter can be psychologically depressing, a pattern that modern psychology recognizes as seasonal affective disorder. For someone like Washington, the seasonal variations would have affected his mood and his psychological state as he approached evening and night. The religious and cultural calendar also affected how the seasons were experienced. Christmas in winter, Easter in spring, various religious holidays and observances throughout the year would have shaped how the seasons were marked and experienced. The changes in the liturgical calendar, the rhythms of agriculture, the practical necessities of dealing with weather, all of these would have created different textures to different seasons. Memory, regret, and the night let us now turn to one of the most significant dimensions of consciousness that emerges in the evening and night hours, the dimension of memory of the past, of the things that have been and cannot be undone. George Washington lived through significant historical moments. He fought in the French and Indian War. He was a commander in the American Revolutionary War. He was the first president of the United States. He was an influential figure in the creation of the Constitution. His life was not lived in obscurity. The things he did mattered. They affected the course of history. They affected the lives of millions of people. But a human being, even a historically significant one, is also simply a person living a life moment by moment. The person experiences doubt, makes mistakes, has regrets. The evening and night hours are when these personal dimensions often become more present. when the individual self, rather than the historical figure, comes to the foreground of consciousness. What memories might have come to Washington in the quiet of evening? Moments from the war, perhaps. The men who died under his command, battles that were lost as well as won. Decisions made in the heat of the moment that might have been made differently with more time and more information. The suffering he had witnessed, the hardship endured, the fear experienced, all of these would have been part of his memory, available in the evening hours. Memories from his personal life would have been present as well. His first wife, who died while he was still living, would have been in his memory. The relationship with his second wife, Martha, the complex family relationships, the losses of people who were close to him, all of these would have been part of the landscape of memory. The question of slavery, which we have touched on but which deserves more sustained attention, would have been a haunting memory and a present reality. Washington enslaved hundreds of people. He lived in a slave society. His wealth and his lifestyle were built on slavery, and yet he seems to have had some awareness that slavery was wrong. The tension between what he was doing and what he believed to be right would have been a source of internal conflict. In the evening and night hours, when the public justifications were less insistent, when the person could be alone with himself, this conflict might have come to the fore more directly. The specific regrets would have been different depending on what had happened during the day and what was preoccupying his mind. If there had been a difficult interaction with someone, if he had spoken sharply or acted in a way he later regretted, the evening hours might bring reflection on this. If there was a decision he was struggling with, the pros and cons might repeat endlessly in his mind, each argument countering the other, no resolution emerging. The awareness of the passage of time, of the things that will not be done now, would have been particular in the evening and night hours. The awareness of opportunities missed, of people encountered briefly who then disappeared from life, of possibilities that were not taken, all of this would have been part of the texture of memory in the quiet hours. The practice of reviewing one's life, of examining one's actions and motivations, was part of the reflective tradition that Washington would have been familiar with. This kind of review, this kind of honest examination of what has been done and what has been left undone can be painful. It can also be clarifying and can lead to growth. The evening and night hours were times when such examination could occur. And yet the examination was not purely negative. Washington had done things worth doing. He had been effective in many ways. He had influenced the course of history in positive directions, whatever the complications and whatever was left undone. The awareness of having lived a consequential life, of having attempted great things, of having succeeded in many ways, this would also have been part of the consciousness of the evening hours. The balance between pride and humility, between satisfaction and regret, between the sense of having done well and the awareness of having done wrong, this balance would have been something Washington navigated constantly. In the evening and night hours, each of these aspects of his life and his choices would have been more available to consciousness than during the busy day. The rhythm of rest and restoration, the evening and night hours viewed in their totality, are a time of rest and restoration. This is something obvious and yet worth examining more carefully, because the process of rest and restoration is not simple, and it takes different forms depending on the person and the circumstances. Physical rest is one dimension. The body, having been active during the day, becomes less active in the evening. The muscles relax, the heart rate slows, the various systems of the body shift into a different mode. Sleep, the most complete form of physical rest, allows for the restoration of the body's physical systems, the repair of damage, the consolidation of learning and memory. Even if Washington was not sleeping deeply and peacefully through the entire night, he would have been obtaining some physical rest, and this rest would have been important to his physical health. Mental and emotional rest is another dimension. The mind, having been engaged with various tasks and concerns during the day, can become quieter in the evening. The constant stream of problem-solving and decision-making can diminish. The emotions, which might have been suppressed or controlled during the day, can have more freedom. The evening and night hours could provide a kind of clearing, a space where the mind and emotions could settle and reset. Psychological rest, the diminishment of the need to perform a role, to maintain an image, to be constantly aware of how one's actions are perceived, is another form of restoration. The evening and night hours in the privacy of one's chamber provided space where Washington could simply be without the constant need to be the man of authority, the person of consequence. This kind of psychological rest, the ability to drop the persona and be oneself, is deeply restorative. Spiritual rest, the opportunity to engage with questions of meaning and purpose, to align oneself with one's deeper values, is another form of restoration. The evening and night hours could provide space for this kind of engagement, whether through reading philosophy, through prayer or religious practice, through reflection and meditation, or simply through the particular quality of consciousness that comes in quietude and darkness. The restoration that comes from rest is not instantaneous. It accumulates over time. The person who sleeps well and has adequate quiet time recovers and renews. The person who is constantly driven, constantly on display, constantly engaged without respite, gradually becomes depleted. The evening and night hours were for Washington the space where restoration could occur, the space where the demands of the day could be left behind and the person could recover. This restoration was essential. Washington was a person who carried enormous responsibility, who had to make important decisions, who was constantly observed and evaluated. Without the space to recover and renew, the sustained performance of this role would have been impossible. The evening and night hours were not a luxury. They were a necessity, as essential to his well-being and his effectiveness as food or water. The quality of rest that Washington received would have varied. Some nights he would have slept well and awoken restored. Other nights his mind would have been active, his body uncomfortable, his sleep fitful. The variation is natural. What matters is the overall pattern, the general availability of time and space for rest and restoration. The importance of this rest and restoration to Washington's ability to function, to make the decisions that shaped a nation, to manage a large estate, to live through a long life with a body that was often uncomfortable, cannot be overstated. The evening and night hours were not simply time lost to activity, time when nothing happened. They were essential time when the person recovered and renewed, time when the resources for the next day were replenished. The domestic environment and intimacy. We should also spend time considering the domestic environment of Washington's evening and night, particularly his relationship with his wife Martha and the quality of the intimate domestic space they shared. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington was not a secondary figure in Washington's life. She was his partner, his wife, his companion for decades. She had been married before to Daniel Park Custis and had brought children and wealth to the marriage with George Washington. The relationship between George and Martha was apparently one of affection and partnership, though it was not a marriage of great romantic passion. It was a practical partnership, undertaken by two people of mature age who each brought substantial resources and experience to the union. Martha would often have been present in the evening hours. They would have dined together, spent the social hours of the evening in conversation or in the company of family or guests. When Washington retired to his chamber for the night, Martha would likely have retired to her own chamber, as was common for couples of the era. Sleeping in separate chambers was not unusual and was sometimes preferred. This would have given Washington the solitude and privacy that he seems to have valued, while also maintaining the intimacy and partnership of the marriage. The domestic environment, the home that they shared, was shaped by both of them. Martha brought to the household the experience of having managed a large estate with her first husband, and she seems to have been actively involved in the management of Mount Vernon. She was concerned with the household, with the care of the family members who lived there, with the quality of the home. The evening hours would have reflected her influence as well as Washington's. The warmth of the home, the sense of it being a refuge and a place of comfort, would have been shaped by Martha's presence. She created an environment where Washington could rest, where family life could happen, where there was a sense of belonging. The evening and night hours would have been different without her presence, without her management of the household, without her companionship. There is something about domestic space, a home that is properly maintained, that is calm and ordered, that contributes to the ability to rest and to feel at peace. The home at Mount Vernon, with all its servants and enslaved people, with all the machinery of a large household operating to create comfort, provided Washington with a space where he could retreat. The intimate space of the bedroom, the bed itself, is a particularly human space. It is where we are vulnerable, where we are without our defenses, where we are our most basic selves. For Washington, the bedroom was a place where he could be fully himself without the need to maintain an image. The comfort of the bed, the warmth of the bedclothes, the darkness that allowed for privacy and inwardness, all of these would have contributed to his sense of security and rest. The rituals of the household in the evening, the preparations for bed, the various people who moved through the space to accomplish these preparations, the handing of one service to another, all of this created a context within which Washington could rest. The household was arranged to serve him, to anticipate his needs, to provide him with comfort. This is something that comes to us through the lens of modern consciousness as troubling, as dependent on slavery and inequality, and it is. But it is also the reality that shaped Washington's evening and night hours. The comfort he experienced was built on the labor of others, both enslaved and free. The deeper consciousness of night, as we move deeper into the hours of the night in this narrative, we should consider the particular character of consciousness that comes in the hours of darkness, the way that the mind works differently when it is not occupied with the demands of the day. The night consciousness is different from day consciousness. During the day, the mind is oriented toward the external world, toward action and task completion, toward engagement with other people, toward managing the practical demands of life. During the night, particularly in sleep or in the quiet wakefulness of the late hours, the mind turns inward. The focus shifts from external reality to internal reality, from the practical to the imaginative and reflective. This shift in consciousness is not a small thing. It is not simply a matter of having less to do and therefore having more time for reflection. It is a genuine shift in the mode of consciousness, a different way of knowing and perceiving. The dreamlike quality of late-night wakefulness, the way that thoughts seem to flow and shift in different patterns, the way that emotions can be more intense or more accessible, all of these are characteristics of the night consciousness. For someone like Washington, a man who was habitually engaged in practical management and external action, the shift into night consciousness might have been particularly marked. The relieving of the external demands would have allowed the internal dimensions of consciousness to come forward more fully. The thoughts that are suppressed or pushed aside during the active day might have emerged in the quiet of night. The night also seems to be the time when the full weight of emotional reality can come forward. During the day, emotions can be managed, controlled, expressed in socially acceptable ways. In the night, in solitude, the emotions can be more fully present. Sadness, regret, grief, fear, anxiety, joy, contentment, all of these can be felt more acutely in the night hours than they are during the day. The awareness of the self, the sense of I as a particular consciousness inhabiting a particular body in a particular moment, is heightened in the night hours. The distractions of the day, the engagement with external reality, create a kind of diffusion of consciousness. In the night, the consciousness becomes more concentrated, more aware of itself, more present to itself. This heightened self-awareness can be productive. It can lead to insight, to understanding of oneself and one's motivations, to clarity about what matters. It can also be disturbing. The awareness of one's own mortality, one's own finitude, one's own limitations can become acute. The things that are normally pushed to the periphery can come to the center of consciousness. For Washington, the night consciousness would have included awareness of his aging, of the things he had not accomplished, of the things that troubled his conscience. It would have included awareness of his physical body, the aches and pains and limitations that come with age. It would have included reflections on his life, his choices, the meaning of his existence. And yet the night consciousness is not purely introspective or philosophical. It is also the site of imagination, of possibility, of dreams. In the night, the mind can wander into fantasy and imagination in ways that it cannot during the day. Possibilities can be imagined that are not constrained by practicality. The mind can play with ideas, can imagine different outcomes, can explore possibilities that are not grounded in the real world. For someone like Washington, whose waking life was constrained by responsibility and necessity, the night might have provided space for imagination, for the exploration of possibilities that were not constrained by the demands of reality. What if he had made different choices? What if the nation had developed differently? What if he had addressed slavery directly? What if he had lived differently? These questions, explored in the imagination of the night, might not have led to action in the day, but they would have been part of the texture of his inner life. Peace and restlessness. It would be inaccurate to describe Washington's evening and night hours as universally peaceful. While there were certainly times of peace and quiet, there would also have been times of restlessness, of discomfort, of inability to find peace. The physical discomfort would have been a source of restlessness. Joint pain, particularly when lying in bed, when the weight of the body presses on joints and when movement is constrained, can make sleep difficult and can make the hours of the night feel long and uncomfortable. The dental pain that troubled Washington throughout his life would have been difficult to manage in bed. The various other ailments that come with aging would have created discomfort. The mental restlessness would also have been present at times. A mind that is preoccupied with a problem can circle around it endlessly without finding resolution. If Washington was troubled by a decision that needed to be made, by a political conflict that was emerging, by a family matter that was difficult, these preoccupations could keep the mind active, preventing sleep, creating a restless quality to the night hours. The emotional restlessness would have been present as well. If Washington was experiencing anxiety, fear, grief, or other strong emotions, the evening hours might have been times when these emotions were more acute, more difficult to manage. The quiet of the night, rather than being peaceful, might have been a time when the emotions were more present and more difficult to bear. The restlessness might have taken the form of getting up from bed, moving around the room, perhaps going to look out the window or to sit by a fire. The restlessness might have involved picking up a book and trying to read by candlelight, hoping that engaging the mind with something external might settle the internal state. The restlessness might have simply been a matter of lying in bed, unable to sleep, waiting for sleep to come, frustrated by the inability to find the peace that sleep would bring. This restlessness is part of the human condition. Not all nights are restful. Not all evening hours bring peace. The experience of struggling to sleep, of being uncomfortable, of having an active mind that will not quiet, is something that many people know. Washington would have known it as well. The question of how to manage restlessness, how to find peace when it is elusive, would have been relevant for Washington. The various remedies available to him, the warm drinks, the herbal preparations, the practices meant to promote sleep, would have been put to use on nights when sleep was difficult. The philosophical resources available to him, the stoic acceptance of what cannot be changed, the practice of focusing on what is within one's control would have been relevant as well. The restlessness itself, while uncomfortable, was not entirely without value. It was a sign of engagement, of concern, of a mind that was actively engaged with the world and its problems. A person who never felt restless, who never struggled with the demands of consciousness and responsibility, would have been a different kind of person. The restlessness was the shadow side of the engagement and responsibility that defined Washington's life. The approach of sleep. Again, as our narrative moves through the extended hours we have been exploring, we find ourselves returning again and again to the approach of sleep. Sleep is cyclical. The approach to sleep happens every night. The awakening happens every morning. The cycle continues throughout life. For Washington, in the evening hours, the approach of sleep would have been something he negotiated with his body and mind. As the evening progressed and the hours grew late, there would have come a point where the body began to signal its readiness for sleep. The fatigue would accumulate. The sense that sleep was approaching would become more present. The preparations for sleep would intensify as this moment approached. The final tasks of the day would be completed. The final preparations of the room would be made. The body would be washed and dressed in sleeping clothes. The mind would begin to move away from the concerns of the day and toward the inward focus of sleep. The entire household would be settling into the rhythm of approaching sleep. The quality of approaching sleep is particular. There is a transitional quality to it, a moving from one state of consciousness to another. The body becomes heavy. The mind becomes quieter. The world of external reality becomes less accessible. The boundaries between self and world begin to blur. The sense of time changes. Minutes seem to expand or contract. For someone lying in bed waiting for sleep to come, there is often a particular kind of awareness of the body, of the bed, of the darkness around them. The awareness of breathing becomes more present. The awareness of the heartbeat can become more noticeable. The awareness of various physical sensations becomes more acute. The body is being prepared for sleep, is being released from the tensions of wakefulness. The mind, as it approaches sleep, begins to let go of control. The thoughts become less logical, less organized. Images and ideas begin to flow more freely. The distinction between memory and imagination begins to blur. The mind is no longer trying to accomplish anything. It is simply present, aware, moving toward the release of sleep. This approaching of sleep, this transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, is something that has fascinated human beings across centuries. It is a state that is neither fully awake nor fully asleep. It has a particular character, a particular quality. In this state, insights can come. Creativity can emerge. The barriers between the conscious and unconscious can seem to thin. For Washington, lying in his bed, feeling his body release from the tensions of the day, feeling his mind begin to let go, the approach of sleep would have brought a sense of relief. The burden of consciousness could be set down. The responsibility could be released temporarily. The self could dissolve, merging with the greater darkness and rest of sleep. The hope for sleep, the desire for sleep, the slow sinking into sleep, these would have been part of his experience most nights. The sleep would come, the night would pass. The morning would come again and the cycle would continue. The eternal return of evening. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through George Washington's evening and night hours, we find ourselves in a place of return. The evening comes again as it does every day. The night descends as it does every night. The cycle continues. The specific evening and night hours that we have been exploring are in one sense unique. They are the evening of a particular day, the night of a particular time. They are shaped by the particular circumstances of Washington's life, the particular era in which he lived, the particular person that he was. And yet they are also universal. The evening comes to everyone. The night comes to everyone. The need for rest, the search for peace, the struggle between responsibility and rest, the awareness of the self and the desire to escape the self, all of these are universal human experiences. The particular form they take in Washington's life is particular to him, but the underlying patterns are universal. The evening that descends as we complete this narrative is not the only evening Washington experienced. There were hundreds of evenings, thousands of evening hours throughout his long life. Each had its own character, its own texture, its own particular quality. Some were restful, some were troubled, some were filled with social engagement, some were filled with solitude. All of them were part of the pattern of his life, part of the rhythm that constituted his existence. And we, the listeners to this narrative, we also experience evenings and nights. We also have the need for rest. We also have moments of solitude when the demands of the day are set aside. We also have the opportunity to retreat into darkness and quietude. The evening and night hours are not something that only happened to George Washington. They are happening now to all of us in the continuation of the fundamental rhythm of human existence. The candlelight that illuminated Washington's study is long extinguished. Mount Vernon, the house he built and lived in, is now a museum visited by thousands of people each year. Washington himself is long dead. The nation he helped to create has gone through nearly 2.5 centuries of development. The world has changed beyond imagination, and yet the evening still comes, night still falls. The rhythm of day and night, of activity and rest, of waking and sleeping continues. And in that continuation, we are connected to Washington, to all the people who have lived before us, to all the people who will live after us. The evening that Washington experienced is not so different in its fundamental character from the evening that we experience. The quietude, the darkness, the opportunity for reflection and rest, the release from the demands of the day, the slow approach of sleep, these are experiences that connect us across the centuries. They are part of what it means to be human. They are part of the fundamental rhythm of human life. As you, the listener, move toward your own evening, toward your own night, toward your own rest, you carry with you this narrative of Washington's night. You carry with you the image of him, lying in his bed in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, feeling the weight of his body on the mattress, aware of his own consciousness, his own existence, his own mortality. And in this carrying, this narrative becomes not just a story about the past, but something that connects the past to the present, that connects Washington's evening to your evening, that connects his night to your night. The evening and night hours that you will experience tonight are connected to the evening and night hours that Washington experienced centuries ago. The rhythm is the same, the need is the same, the search for peace and rest is the same. So settle into your own night with the awareness that you are participating in something ancient and universal. You are participating in the rhythm of human existence that goes back to the beginning of human time and will continue into the future. You are part of this pattern. Your evening and your night are part of this great continuity. And as you drift towards sleep, as the darkness deepens, as the sounds of the night surround you, know that you are not alone. You are part of a great company of people across centuries who have sought rest in the darkness, who have found peace in the evening hours, who have released the burden of consciousness into sleep. The evening comes, the night falls, we rest, we awaken, the cycle continues. This is the ancient rhythm of human life, and it continues still, even now, even as you listen to this narrative and prepare yourself for your own evening and your own night. Thank you for spending these hours in the evening and night of George Washington. Thank you for slowing down, for settling in, for allowing yourself to be present to the quiet and the darkness and the peace that the evening and night can bring. May your evening be restful. May your night be peaceful. May you find in the darkness the solitude and the quiet that you need. May you release, as Washington released, the burdens of the day, and may you find in sleep the restoration and renewal that all human beings need and deserve. The evening comes again tomorrow. The night will fall again tomorrow. The rhythm continues. And in this continuation, we are all part of something greater than ourselves, something that has been happening since the beginning and will continue until the end. Rest well, sleep deeply. Know that you are part of this ancient and continuing rhythm. And when you wake again, when the morning comes again, you will have been restored by the night, as all people have been restored by night since the beginning of time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your presence in this story. Thank you for allowing yourself to slow down and to step into the quiet and peace of the evening hours. The night is yours now. The darkness is yours. The silence is yours. Use it well. Rest in it. Let it restore you. And tomorrow, when you wake, you will be ready again for the day.